Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. On January 14th, Uganda held national elections for president and parliament. The incumbent was the 76-year-old Yoweri Museveni, who has ruled Uganda since 1986. His main challenger was a 38-year-old music star turned politician who goes by the stage name Bobi Wine. In the 6 days between the election and the time I'm recording this, Yoweri Museveni has declared victory, and his security forces are laying siege to Bobi Wine and his family, having encircled his compound and placing them under de facto house arrest. International observers were largely blocked from Uganda during the election, and the internet was even cut throughout the country on election day. Needless to say, the election results lack a degree of credibility. On the line to help me understand the current situation in Uganda, including the Fraught election and its aftermath, is Rosebell Kagumire. She is a writer and editor at the publication African Feminism, and I caught up with her from Kampala, Uganda. We kick off with a brief discussion of the current state of play. She then discusses how the unique biography of Bobi Wine makes him such a compelling figure to challenge the decades-long hold on power of Museveni and the ruling class. We also discuss how international pressure may be required to hold Museveni to democratic norms. So as I mentioned, I am recording this intro, and we recorded this conversation on January 20th, just a few days after the election. Needless to say, this is a rapidly evolving situation, and this conversation, I think, does a good job of providing you the context you need to understand events as they unfold in the coming days and weeks and months. And today's episode is supported in part from a grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York to showcase African voices in peace and security issues. To view other episodes in this series, please go to globaldispatchespodcast.com. All right, now here is my conversation with Rosebell Kagumire of African Feminism. I'm glad that internet has apparently been restored because you and I are able to speak. When did they turn back the internet on?
I think Monday afternoon.
And is social media platforms still restricted access?
Yes, so we are using VPNs. Yeah, currently.
I've been following you on Twitter forever, so it's always good to see you back online. So I was worried there for a while that we wouldn't be able to do this interview. But what's going on with Bobi Wine right now? Like, what do we know about the current state of play Wednesday as we're speaking?
He's still under house arrest. He's not yet out of his house. I don't know if he's gotten anyone to visit them because most of the people that were supposed to visit have been blocked since the election day. So it's the situation. They are really being held hostage in their own house together with his wife. And surprisingly, there's a toddler there who was visiting them.
Yeah, I saw he posted it, he posted on Twitter that he has his niece or nephew there, and he's unable to get any food or supplies and milk because of the house arrest. And even I saw the other day that the U.S. ambassador was turned away by security forces as she tried to visit him.
Yes, absolutely. They refused her entrance, and later, the government put out a statement. I don't remember exact words, labeling her attempt as kind of like subversion or something, which is really a dark kind of move for people who are illegally detaining somebody in their own house to actually quantify the attempt by the ambassador to visit him as that. It really shows you how it is worrying how crazy the regime might get, in the past, such moves were actually a bit respected. And I wasn't surprised with the turning her away, but also the subsequent statements. You wonder who's in charge of now responding to this kind of things. So what's happening in the regime circle?
What's the ostensible justification given for placing Bobi Wine and his compound under siege?
It's just by the book, how Museveni plays. This is not the first time. Basically, in 2016 was held for 42 days after the election that he did not accept.
This is the previous opposition leader who last time around ran against Museveni in 2016 you're referring to.
Exactly. So he'd been the long-running main rival of President Museveni from early 2000 until last. He did not contest in the just finished election, but Dr. Kizza Besigye is one of the leading opposition people against President Museveni. So in the last election, surprisingly, the results are almost the same. There's only like a point separating the results of Bobi Wine and Besigye and in the previous election and in this election, and the kind of response to their to the announcement of Museveni once again as the winner it's the same. So it's almost copy and paste, from.
Does that suggest to you that the election was improperly held?
Of course, it was an election held in the dark. So when you switch off entire internet in the country a day before election, you can't provide people with results that are in line with the Constitution, because the Constitution asks for results that are tallied from districts, not from polling stations. You have to present to the nation what districts voted like. We still don't have those kinds of results from the Electoral Commission. So then you wonder, what did they use? What method did they use to announce the final vote? Then there's also a curious case of which they have accepted, that they never included over 1,000 polling stations in their counting. So definitely very, very wide irregularities. And my feeling is that this is on purpose. In 2016, they actually did not allow Kampala and the surrounding centers, urban centers, to vote. They voted so late that by the time the results were coming in, they had already declared President Museveni the winner. So these kind of tactics have been around for a while.
The idea is that the hotbed of the opposition would be Kampala and the surrounding urban centers, as opposed to Museveni's more rural-based power.
Absolutely. So there's the opposition stronghold being the center of the country where the capital is, but also urban centers who are actually targeted in that, because a bit of urban centers are going to be a little more progressive in terms of understanding what the state of the politics in the country is and what is at stake. So definitely we can trust. We don't know. The joke is like we have never known election results in the country because we've never had a free and fair election.
Who is Bobi Wine? Can you, for people who are unfamiliar with his story, his backstory, can you share a bit about his biography and how he emerged as a sudden and really impressive political force in the country?
That's a complex job, but I'll give it a try. So Bobi Wine, and I'm almost the same age as Bobi Wine, and I went to school with his wife.
Oh no!
He sat in the same class. We were in the same volleyball team and played in the same sports, and came to university together. So this is around early 2000s. He rose around early 2000s, around 2002, 2003. Rather 2003 to 2006 on the scene, and his kind of music was very, it has a kind of Jamaican dance hall beats to it, but infused with the story of the underdog, the story of many of us coming from very poor backgrounds, in the country, but very much not just poor background, but very focused on the urban. At that time, the population of Uganda wasn't that as big as now, because we are 40 million and almost 78% are below the age of 75. So even as a young man, he lived in the informal settlements around Kampala, which have poor housing, poor services. So this was, even when he mixed a love story here and there, it was embedded in the struggle of the urban poor. And those stories were not just for the urban poor, but also they resonated with the general struggling population. And while the current young people, he's I don't know in another country if they would call him young or they call me young, but in Uganda, because we've had a stronghold of old men on power, in the dynamics of Uganda, when you speak up, they see you as a young person, which I find very condescending because a young person should be like 20 years old. So, and Bobi Wine started pushing for that change around that age, around his 20s, So it was more. He got more bolder as he grew, and also as the reality of inequalities in Uganda have enlarged under Museveni. Even when he's applauded for economic, not transformation, but economic recovery of the country from a war. Of course, a war he participated in, and then overlooking over recovery of an economy, the reality is that the inequalities in the country have grown so high between regions, between urban and rural. We see this between men and women. We see these inequalities high. So as more people feel like the government is not having them at heart or putting them at the center of policy, then his songs became more appealing to more people. So that's really the story of how he came into the consciousness of Ugandans, not just as a politician, but a very conscious musician.
What do we know about how he decided to make the transition to enter politics so seemingly abruptly just a few years ago? From being a politically conscious musician to be a politician is still like a very big step. How and why did he decide to do so?
Of course, he had confrontations often from his music, from his base in a Kampala suburb called Kamocha, which is an informal settlement with many poor people, poor communities. He was seen as their representative. So when Yoweri Museveni put a person in charge of the city, who was a city executive, who was really implementing Museveni's anti-poor policies, evicting traders, evicting people, Bobi Wine was the voice of the people. I think that's when he became bold, fighting Kampala. Even one of his kids is called Kampala, so he was really strong. That's when they started calling him the ghetto president. He was representing the voices of the minorities. So long before he jumped into in the elective politics, he was already, he worked his way being the voice of the people, and his songs were banned on radio stations, and that gave him the kind of attention countrywide, and people wanted to know why is the song banned. And he was speaking the issues that very few musicians at the time, when musicians were being bought by the president and to pay them to play another good tune praising the president, Bobi Wine was kind of producing this hard-hitting music. And music has always been at the heart of resistance in Uganda since colonial times. So definitely he did not arrive here by accident.
So it seems like forces of history, almost both demographic history of Uganda and in terms of what the age looks like and where people live, plus the fact that a country animated by music as resistance now has this resistance figure who's a popular musician. It all seemed to conspire in his favor. and he decided to run for president in what seemingly from the outside seemed like an audacious thing, a musician running to oust one of the longest serving presidents in Africa. What was the government's response to his campaign? We know there was a great deal of violence over the summer in particular, but in general, can you just tell listeners what happened after he decided to run and during his campaigning?
Of course, it must be noted that Bobi Wine stood for parliamentary seat before he came to the presidential seat. He's been in parliament, I think, for 3 years before he came to contest for the election. Even his election, his parliamentary seat election was very heated. The government invested a lot of money to make sure he doesn't win, and he won. So he came to the parliament, and around that time, that's when President Museveni was, forced, working with his party in parliament, laid the final change of the constitution that gave him a go ahead to run again, because we had a clause in our constitution that said when you are over 75, you are not going to vie for office. Of course, brought in by Yoweri Museveni, who was so naive and who thought he would actually live up to his own expectations. Unfortunately not. So he had to come back around 2017 when Bobi Wine gets to parliament. This is when the heated moment in the country, as the president showed that he is probably going to die in power, because at this age, if you're changing the constitution, where are you going? What are we headed for? So the country was tense. And from the series of events that happened before he actually came to the presidency, he was arrested with his friends in the northern district of Arua, where he had gone to support one of the friends in a by-election, and they were beaten by the military, detained for many days. His driver was murdered right in his car. He actually escaped being assassinated in that time. I think those events shaped then what were his choices. He was already a threat. He was being seen as a threat. And everywhere he went in by-elections, whoever he supported was kind of going through. Somehow there was this wave that people couldn't explain, because even the regime, President Museveni's regime, tried to paint him as this weed smoking. Of course, he, as a musician, he has these pictures of himself smoking from the younger days in his 20s. Tried to paint him as a delinquent and who cannot lead. But unfortunately, the more they put this out, the more this appealed to young people who probably don't care what Bobi Wine smokes even today or yesterday. So you have to see that kind of build up to what informed him to actually run for presidency. And we've seen it before, even with Dr. Kizza Besigye. Once the President Museveni corners you, he identifies you, there's an attempt on your life, what do you go for next? If you announce that he announced way early that you're going to try to be a president, that kind of then puts him in the spotlight that he's trying to kill his actual rival. So Bobi Wine went for that. In the surroundings of that was already violent coming to this election.
That's interesting. So by announcing that he was going to oppose Museveni as president, he potentially held off an assassination attempt on his life.
Let's say it made it much more careful on that part of the regime on how they would deal with him as a person, because there was an attempt they killed his driver and missed him. They had all trumped up charges of treason, that he had guns or this and that. But I think for him, this was very protective. Yeah. And also it was actually capitalizing on the newfound wave that the country had probably last seen in the early 2000s when Dr. Kizza Besigye came to the scene.
And then, of course, during the campaign, there was violence and he was attacked. There were some kind of famous scenes in which his sort of car was attacked. And even like recently during a Zoom press conference with a bunch of international press as well, he just, soldiers started harassing him. It seemed that the harassment, though, never ceased.
No, because as long as the kind of the president saw that the country was, especially in response when he finally changed the constitution. This was his second time. Early mid 2005, there he changed the constitution on term limits to allow infinite terms for a president. But now, when he was going to change the age, it was a final blow to the constitution. The hopes of Ugandans that Museveni would actually try to preside over transition. So that was put out of the minds of the people. So then he still controls the army. So he has all sorts of resources at his disposal to pile onto any opponent. So the violence since that time, since he changed the constitution to run, if you were anyone who was going to run after him, it was obvious that the constitution was being changed for him to run, not anyone else. Then it was also wise for Bobi Wine to really also announce his presidential aspirations.
We are speaking on Wednesday, January 20th. Bobi Wine is currently under house arrest. We don't know how this situation will play out. I'm curious to learn from you, what do you think will happen next? And what will you be looking for that will suggest to you how this standoff will resolve and how the political situation will resolve itself over the coming weeks and months?
To be honest, the country has been pushed on the wall, so very uncertain. We are in a very, very uncertain time because you have a president who's not willing to relinquish power, who is using the military. There are many things that could happen. He can still say, "I'm going to salvage my remaining, little image and try to preside over a transition, give people a hope," because the reality is that even many who would have voted him, even in this skewed results they are giving us, even if it were true that the people voted him of 58%, majority of them are voting him because they're scared of the consequences. A day before the election, we had, military helicopters flying all over the city, very low, like threatening people. We had tankers staged in the middle of the capital of the city. You'd think we are at war. So these kinds of military show of might against his own people pushes, because people are traumatized by past events of regimes and war. They said, okay, let's give him the last time he will, whatever happens, maybe we hope he doesn't come back. But he could use that and turn around and hand over power and and make sure that we have the first peaceful transfer of power since we got independence in 1962. So many things could happen, I don't know. But for him to do that, there has to be a very big shift in how the West and international players are playing the role they're playing in upholding Museveni's dictatorship. Are they going to be tougher with him? What conditions are they going to set? And what kind of response then would that elicit from the president? The other thing would be...
Can I ask, just as a Westerner, and I know most of my audience are policy people in the West, like what would specific actions by the West look like? Are you talking about, say, withholding of bilateral aid to Uganda from, say, the European Union or the United States? What are you suggesting might be impactful?
It could be a mixture of many things, because Museveni gets his military support from the West mostly. America is one of our topmost. We are one of America's topmost military aid in the continent. So that this kind of upholding a dictatorship, all these weapons that are used on our streets are not by our tax money. They are by Westerners who fund us. And Museveni has maintained military bases. And on behalf of the West too, in Somalia, we have military in Equatorial Guinea, where he's protecting the oil and wealth resources with Theodore Obiang, who is also another long-running African president. He represents military interests of the West and other international players. So how are they going to backtrack that to allow a country to ease, to breathe, so that we can figure out a better path to a new generation of leaders, because this, whether they want it or not, is coming to an end. It doesn't matter how much he possesses at his, we don't know, we don't even agree on his age, at the late 70s, that is his official age. What more can they have after 5 years? Like, as we have seen with countries like Zimbabwe and others, this can only descend into chaos and lawlessness. And he cannot continue to keep the military guarding the city for him and people not being free. That in itself is going to have an impact on how the economics works and how people feel that they can actually still work in this country and live in this country. So there are many things they could do, but I'm flagging the military base, the military, him being their military go-to guy if they want an intervention in which country, Rwanda, Congo. That has unfortunately happened at the expense of our fight for democracy. So that is going to be something to keep an eye on, how all these international actors respond to a blatant violation, which is not new, but really we still have thousands of young people in jail for simply supporting opposition. So this mass incarceration of young men and young women, killing of young people, we saw over 50 people murdered in Kampala a month and a half before the election. We had never seen that level of violence in the capital since the 80s, I think. So these are all indications of, like, we're going to a dark road. We are already in the middle of a dark, so many players have a role to play, and their role will also affect how the confidence the regime feels in violating our rights. Young people are determined to fight on. So this is, whether he has the guns or not, the minds of the people have shifted away from him, and he just needs to realize that people are tired and they need something. They need to feel like they can choose their next leader. And whether it's Bobi Wine or any other person, it has to be recognized that young people are fighting and they're determined. And you can't take this kind of determination away, even when you lay down, I don't know how many, you put how much weaponry in front of young people. They are continuing to say, this is my home. And before I was born, you were here. And I'm old enough to demand for what I think, how I need to be governed.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Rosebell. This was very helpful.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Rosebell. That was a very helpful conversation. And I think this does give really good context for understanding events as they unfold. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I've been following Rosebell on Twitter for years, and I'll post a link to her Twitter page in the show notes of this episode. And one disclaimer, that the opinions that have been expressed in this episode belong solely to those who expressed the opinions. It's always such an awkward formulation. Anyway, see you next time. Thanks. Bye.